you're okay with this, like, access to this world of information. At the same time, you don't want like people who are trained, people who are experts on this to have this conversation in a safe space. A big fear is that it will lead to more sexual activity, that it will become acceptable, and that's something that parents are really not okay with.
So with programs like this, sometimes we see, further on benefits down the line besides just the programmatic intent. Like if your program, if Kotha does a great job at sex education and these kids are fully versed in sex education, that in itself would be excellent. But have you seen any other additional educational benefits to your program?
We say comprehensive sex ed very intentionally because a big part of it is to teach kids critical thinking skills, which is absent in a lot of school curriculum. So I think the critical thinking obviously is transferable to like any other aspect of their lives. But also I think something that I think just the education landscape can benefit from is just experimenting more with what the classroom space can look like. So like I mentioned before, some of the interactive tools that we use is video screenings. We use comic strips that we make like based off of like real life scenarios that these kids would see in their life. And we do role plays. One of our most favorite activities that we've kind of continued since the very beginning for our class on gender norms is we'll have students do a parody advertisement on a product that exaggerates a gender norm. So one product that came out of that exercise was Insta Beard, because, masculinity and facial hair is big in South Asia. So the idea of the product was you would spray it on, you'd get a beard the next day, and you would you would automatically gain so much social capital. You'd get all the girls, you'd get the marriage proposals. And I thought that was hilarious. We also had like Uber for like Uber man, like you could like call a man to like lift up your backpack because fragile women can't do that for themselves. Yes. So like, and like that really like helps them connect to the material in a way that they would not if they were like just reading something or even a worksheet. I feel like older generations think worksheets are like the coolest innovation. And like literally we had students who, I think the same school that we were running the Kotha school program, their staff, they had a counselor who was trying to kind of introduce some mental health stuff. And they're like, she comes in, she brings in these worksheets, no one pays attention to the worksheets, and the class is over and we're done. But with Kotha, like we're like waiting for when you guys are coming to our classrooms next. So I think incorporating more of those like gamifying education or like using these tools where kids really see themselves reflected in like case studies and examples, that's something that teachers from like any other subjects could really incorporate to expand their learning experience. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, 'cause traditional schools, you have that, like you said, you have that teacher who stands in front of the room and they're older and intimidating.
Yeah.
And they tell you to do something and you do it. And, for some sections, for like starting a unit on math, that might be the appropriate method. But for other parts of like other classes and other means of learning, it really does help to have, new, innovations in education coming in.
Yeah.
Even if they're focused on, what is not 80% of the day isn't going to be sexual education. So you got to find other ways to apply those methods to other subjects that may be usually a little more dull. And so Kotha is not just Kotha in schools. So you have many more programs. What are your goals for the future of this organization?
So the very, very big picture goal is to become a key player in the feminist movement in Bangladesh. And the ultimate goal is, as I mentioned in the very beginning with what it started with, a radical shift in society's attitude towards gender-based violence. And that sounds very abstract and vague, but I think like a vision for a community-based feminist organization needs to be that. Like I can't be like, my 5-year goal is like to, hit this many targets and like check off these indicators, that can be it. With Kotha at School specifically, this year we've expanded our work to universities. So we've gone to 9 public universities across Bangladesh, moved out of like the capital city of Dhaka. So that work is expanding. And I think a big thing that we believe in is like structural and institutional change. So we don't want to just be an ad hoc program, but we want schools to implement institutional change. So we really want to like push for that. Also just carry on like reimagining what work on gender-based violence should be like beyond just specific service delivery stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you see this as, part of a larger social movement to end, gender-based violence, gender-based oppression.
Yeah.
So how do you see a social movement as a lever to change policy?
I feel like I have to talk about this if I'm talking about like social movement and policy change and Kotha and gender-based violence in Bangladesh. In 2020, during the pandemic, Bangladesh saw one of the largest anti-rape movements that the country has seen in recent years. And Kotha and myself, we were core organizers and kind of were heavily involved in every step of that process, from like building coalitions with other women's rights, gender-based, or other women's rights organizations or organizations working on gender-based violence, legal aid organizations, NGOs, research institutes, building coalitions, drafting national charter of demands, and then figuring out our advocacy agenda, to like figuring out protest chants and slogans, to like figuring out where we will demonstrate, how we're going to mobilize people. So we were very like knee deep into this whole process. And connecting this to the conversation that we're having on education, one of the 10 demands that we had was mandatory comprehensive sex ed, because we usually what happens for rape protests is a lot of the rage and energy is directed towards individual perpetrators, that, okay, you have to hang that rapist, or you have to, put that rapist in jail, or it is directed towards the government. Hey, as a state, you failed to protect your women, yada, yada. But this was, we really wanted to communicate that this was a culture in the country that led to this problem. And part of that culture is society. Part of that culture is your family. Part of that culture is your schools and education institutions. And they have a real responsibility to tackle this culture. On that note, we added mandatory comprehensive sex ed as one of our 10 demands. And what that did was, it took this conversation that was happening at roundtable discussions with policymakers or at research institute. It took that out of those spaces out into the open, literally out into the open. If you walk down the streets of Dhaka around that time, actually, I believe those graffitis are still there. You had like leading elite schools, and on their walls outside, you had graffiti that said, make comprehensive sex ed mandatory. And then if you think of when I started in 2016, where I couldn't even say the word sex ed, to now walking down and seeing this art publicly, that is just, I feel like just in front of you, you see things change. And if we did not have mass protests where this was held up as a collective demand, and we had the collective voice to literally shout out about it, I don't think we would have seen the momentum that it has gained now. The fact that, schools are seriously considering putting this into their budgetary decisions, that the government is, making public declarations about incorporating it, about newer organizations that are coming up to have community initiatives on this issue. So this really brought in comprehensive sex ed as a solution to the rape culture in Bangladesh into the conversation that really wasn't there before. So that was kind of cool.
Yeah, that sounds great. I know sometimes the criticism of some social movements is that their goals are vague or nebulous, lofty. And it sounds like what you're working with is something that is really high-minded social goals, but also concrete policy recommendations. I don't know if I've ever heard of as policy-specific graffiti, as you've spoken about. Usually the graffiti demands are a bit more out there, but it's great to hear that people are sound like responding to both the social and the political aspects of what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, something to add to that, actually, yeah, we went in there, and I think the actors that were involved in it had a big role to play. So we had like people who had done legal aid research on like what rape law reforms we needed. We had organizations like Kotha that was working on comprehensive sex ed. So we really knew like what our policy already said. We knew like what programs existed, what needed to be incorporated. So that was what I mentioned. Those gains were on a more macro policy level. But on a micro policy level, we also had something really cool happen. I had drafted, and this was all like happening in a span of like 3-4 days. I remember I didn't eat or like literally did not eat or sleep for that entire like week, and then some. But I had drafted like that night, I had drafted a petition or a template for a petition for schools to, incorporating comprehensive sex ed was one of the demands, but it was essentially a call for schools to end rape culture in their institutions. And it included other things like mechanisms for complaints on discrimination or harassment. But comprehensive sex ed was one of the main ones. And that petition had links to our policy documents. It had links to other leading coalitions that had endorsed comprehensive sex ed as a solution to gender-based violence. In fact, UNICEF considers comprehensive sex ed as one of the only, if not, one of the few, if not only, long-term solutions to gender-based violence. So, like, making schools realize, hey, this is not just, this is not just something that has kind of come out of thin air. There's, like, years of research that has gone into it, backed by now a group of very angry people that are going to be screaming at you if you don't do this. And so the idea behind that petition was that we would send it out because our network was with young people and students. And so we send it out to all different kinds of school communities, publicly available, and school communities mobilize themselves to maybe tweak a demand here or two, put their name on the petition and submit it to their admins as themselves. So it wasn't like an outside entity. Again, it was like a community bottom-up approach. And so many schools saw admins going into meetings with 10th graders that are like, okay, let's have a real conversation about it. And then we had, during that time, one of the leading schools declared that they would be adopting those the demands from that petition. So from both a micro and a macro level, like we saw concrete policy changes, as well as like more vague wins, absolutely. I think. Yeah.
That's great. Well, it sounds like you've done some great work with Kotha. The organization is doing great work in the schools in Bangladesh, and hopefully will continue to do great work for a lot more time. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me again.
It was fascinating to hear about your experience, and I'm excited to keep in track.
I will keep you in the loop.
See what great work you continue to do.
Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. Welcome now to the Chicago Policy Review, where we interview a writer from the Chicago Policy Review about a recent article they published. The review article is usually about education policy, but if it's not, we'll try to make them talk about education anyway. Today, we are joined by staff writer Allison Swimmer, who spoke with us about the controversial proposal in California to change the middle school and high school math curriculum. Allison, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Sam.
So you wrote a great article about these new proposed changes to the California statewide math curriculum. Can you tell us about the big changes proposed in the new California mathematics framework?
Yeah. So in the mathematics framework, you might remember from your middle school or high school days, typically Algebra 1 is offered on kind of a standard track in 8th grade. But with this framework, it's pushed to 9th grade. And this can actually deter entire math trajectories, even going into college. Additionally, with this framework, calculus is no longer mandatory. In most schools, it is compulsory if that is the trajectory you're on and you've taken all the other steps, you've taken pre-calc before it. And then there's also an increased emphasis on electives in place of calculus, such as data science. And while this is something that's probably useful and marketable in today's day and age, it's not super logical because statistics and calculus are foundations for such courses. And so it makes a lot more sense to have something like stats or calc before taking data science rather than replacing it. Additionally, these replacements suggested are not in the Common Core State Standards, which is the current framework for curriculum in the United States.
So what was the motivations behind these changes?
So it's interesting that the goal of this was equity and thinking about putting everyone on the same level and thinking about having kids of different aptitudes, which is okay, but that's also the point of schooling, right? The point of schooling is to bring out those aptitudes and to cater to them and to strengthen them if students are falling behind in math or any subject. And by offering classes that aren't so rigorous, it's thinking, okay, we're not setting students up to fail, but in reality, it should be the opposite. We should be setting up students